quickly learned, as you might imagine a young boy would tap into this, I quickly learned how to make homemade gunpowder. And in those days, it was easy to get the components of that, and I mixed it up, and I would vary the proportions and try to get a different response out of burning the gunpowder. But I did a lot of burning of homemade gunpowder. And then I tried to build a rocket engine. I built myself a rocket out of paper, cardboard, whatnot. I had it set up on a launch pad just outside the back door on a concrete pad. And I built my rocket and I put it in the rocket, my rocket engine rather, using my homemade gunpowder. And I figured out how to light it and got it lit, and it just burned up on the pad. Just melted, just disintegrated. Uh, that's science, though. That's science. It's having a hypothesis. It's imagining, well, this is how it's going to work. It's you trying to predict it through the hypothesis, and then you put it together, put an experiment together, and you run your experiment, and the results either affirm or deny your hypothesis. And you learn from the results, whatever they are, and you go back and you adjust your hypothesis, and you keep going in that loop until you kind of converge on a conclusion that you have pretty good confidence in, and then you move on. You put that, maybe that becomes an input into future investigation. That's the whole world of true science, and that's worked out through the the mind that we've been given, bearing the image of God, and the resources that are all around us to experiment with and figure out how to utilize. That's really the story of human space exploration. The nature is governed by laws. And we know, if we know the scriptures, we know there's a moral law as well in a global sense, and there are specific components of the moral law of God. There's also nature's laws, or laws of nature that we call them. Those are also God's laws, and they govern everything that we experience. It's very easy nowadays with the compromise that goes on to include in the churches and then the extreme errors that Justin talked about. It's very easy to compromise a moral law. It's not so easy to compromise a law of nature. If you don't believe in the law of gravity, you're going to get hurt or worse. History of space exploration. Got a couple of pictures I pulled off from history. On the left there is a guy by the name of Robert Goddard. Goddard is known as the father of space exploration in the United States. He theorized and then did experiments to try to develop rockets. He theorized how they might work, and then he built some prototypes, and he was one of the early pioneers in the United States anyway to develop rockets that actually worked, that launched, and he did that through experimentation. And on the right screen, you see a little bit later chapter of life, and I don't know exactly when that occurred, but there's at least the initial launch of that rocket was successful. Of course, if you know the history through the 50s and early 60s, there were a lot of failures of launches. And of course, even in human spaceflight, I was just talking to somebody in the break about the Challenger accident. So there are failures. It's not a forgiving business that we're in. But nonetheless, history shows that mankind has been inspired to do it, and its exploration and discovery. In the 1950s primarily, but leading into the 60s, it was popularized first through science fiction. The guy on the left you might recognize as Walt Disney. Those of you that are older than 40 anyway. Everybody knows about Disney. Well, Walt founded the Disney Corporation, and he worked with Wernher von Braun there on the right part of the screen, who you might remember led the effort in Germany in World War II to develop rockets, the V1 and V2 rockets that rained down on Britain, for example. When the war was won, a very interesting history. In fact, Anna Marie's father was a prisoner of war in the eastern part of Germany, shot down after flying in a B-17 from Europe, and spent 16 months as a prisoner of war in the eastern part of Germany. Was freed by the Russians. I was more afraid of the Russians than the Germans when he got freed, just because of what was going on, their lack of discipline and whatnot. But he was eventually sent to Paris and obviously came back to the U.S. Werner von Braun and his team, when they were kind of in the middle, didn't know if the Americans were going to get to them first or the Russians from the east. Well, they didn't want to go to the Russians, so they all hightailed it west, and we captured Werner von Braun, many of those on his team. We didn't get a lot of the hardware, the rockets that were left. The Soviets got most of the hardware, but we got the brain trust. And Werner von Braun, as you know, became the father of the rocket program that led to the landing on the moon. He really led the development of the Saturn V. He worked with Disney actually to popularize the idea through the 50s. And then he realized it in the 60s. Of course, in the about that time, the Soviet Union was also doing it in parallel, developing rockets, and they launched first Sputnik, and then they launched Yuri Gagarin, a huge geopolitical victory for them, because now they're the world leader in this new technology. And the West went into a little bit of a panic, I suppose you could say. At a minimum, it energized the political will to win back the race, and that started the moon race, of course. Incidentally, prior to this time, there had been a vision, largely formulated by Werner von Braun, a vision for space exploration. And it basically, in fact, it became national policy in 1959 or so, as I recall, the first national policy that said we will develop rocket technology so that we can put a man into orbit. And then in orbit, we'll build a space station. And then from the space station, we'll go to the moon. And then from the moon, we'll go to Mars. And Werner von Braun was the one that largely influenced that vision. When Gagarin launched into space, then our intelligence said, told the administration, they said, well, we're kind of neck and neck with the Soviet Union. I'm not sure we can beat them in the race to put up a space station and then get to the moon. But our intelligence said we probably can beat them in the development of a moon-class rocket. So let's forget the space station. Let's go right to the moon, and let's win what became known as the race to the moon. And that's what we did. And sure enough, we developed the Saturn V rocket, and the Russians, the Soviet Union, was developing what they called the N-1 in parallel. Their prototype N-1 blew up on a launch pad, killed people that were around the launch pad. At that point, they gave up on it. We went on ahead, launched several Apollo flights early on, to include Apollo 8, which was commanded by Frank Borman, was the first flight around the moon. That's famous because he read from Genesis, as you recall, as they orbited the moon. And then the race culminated in victory, of course, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon in Apollo 11 in July 1969. Werner von Braun, by the way, he led the effort, as I said, to develop the rocket and get that successfully there to the moon. In parallel with that, he was developing an infrastructure and a concept that would then take us to Mars. He wanted to go right to Mars. But there was no political will to do so. In fact, there was no political will to go much beyond Apollo 11. We did land on the moon 5 more times. We launched an extra one, Apollo 13, which had the problem and did not land on the moon. But we landed on the moon a total of 6 times. 12 people walked on the moon. But the political will was gone. The program was canceled in 1972 or so. And we were basically grounded for a while until the space shuttle was announced by President Nixon. So that gives you a little bit of historical context. When the space shuttle was envisioned in the early 70s, that was to put us back on the track to put up a space station, to then go to the moon in a more permanent basis, to develop more capability that would then enable us to go to Mars. This is a depiction, an artist depiction, and I don't know the exact date, but I think it was in the mid 1980s. In 1984, President Reagan announced the International Space Station. The space shuttle was developed in the 70s and finally flew its first flight in 1981 and flew several successful flights leading up to 1984 when President Reagan announced Space Station Freedom. Again, putting us back on that track for the strategic vision that the nation had. But he couldn't get Congress to support it. So we went through the 80s, and I think 3 times Congress sent NASA back to the drawing board. You got to do more with less and do it faster, basically, with Space Station Freedom. Then, but still, the vision was have the space shuttle, let's put up a space station, let's go back to the moon, and the red arc there, the red crescent, is Mars. And you'll see in lots of patches, lots of mission patches, especially in the space shuttle time frame, but also in the space station expeditions, you'll see on the patch an element of the moon and the Mars. And even today, we're trying to launch a test flight of a new moon rocket down in Florida, where we were shooting for the end of this month, next week. Actually, it's going to be delayed now because of the tropical storm that's out there threatening it. But we'll have another attempt here in just a week or so to do a test flight on this new moon rocket, with the vision to put not only people back on the moon, but to build an infrastructure on the moon, and in parallel to that, build an infrastructure in the form of a small space station around the moon. All of that infrastructure to enable future abilities to go to Mars. So there's always been this longing to go to Mars. So I forget where it was, if it was Q&A, if it was a conversation. It was yesterday, right? Mars, I consider to be in the Earth system because it's accessible to us theoretically, based on science, based on theory. It's accessible to us from Earth, but we still have to support it from Earth. So that gives you a little bit of a context with what's going on. Now, the International Space Station continues to fly, continues to orbit the Earth. By the way, Freedom was canceled in 1992. And what led to the cancellation was the fall of the Soviet Union. And at that point, a bunch of smart people got together in Crystal City, right outside of Washington, D.C., in our leadership in the space industry in NASA. And they got some of the leadership from the Russians to come over from Moscow. And they got together and they took what was Space Station Freedom and what would have been Mir 2, the Russian space station, the next one to go up, and put them together and made a proposal, and they called it the International Space Station. And that was formulated in 1993. So 1992, Freedom was canceled. 1993, the International Space Station was resurrected. And it took a while, it took through the 90s, but in 1998, we launched the first element of it, the International Space Station. And I believe, back to the geopolitical element, the only reason we're flying people in space today is because we partnered with Russia in 1993. And the real motivation wasn't space exploration. The real motivation was non-proliferation of nuclear and chemical weapon systems coming out of this former Soviet Union, this failed state, if you will, and going to places like Iran and North Korea. So, this is beyond what you might say a strict biblical worldview, but It's a bigger picture, and it's one even as Christians, as we discern what's going on in the world, it's important for us to recognize, to see the bigger picture, and always be trying to educate ourselves to find the truth, the threads of truth in the fog of all of this new term that we over the last couple of years, fake news that is all around us. So just another example. International Space Station, an amazing human achievement. 1998, we launched the first element of it, and we finished it in about 2010. Although we added something in 2011, but the basic assembly was finished in 2010. It was put up primarily by the space shuttle. That was the primary purpose of the space shuttle. The shuttle flew 135 times. 39 or 37 flights of the space shuttle was dedicated to the International Space Station. It was a workhorse. Although it did lots of other things, put up satellites, put up the Hubble Space Telescope, put up planetary probes. Its primary purpose, again, was to put up a space station according to that long-term strategic plan that the country had. It weighed 4 million pounds on the launch pad, 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. In less than 9 minutes, you were in orbit, going 17,500 miles an hour, orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes or 16 times a day, in an orbit that was roughly 250 to 300 miles above the surface of the Earth, so relatively close to the Earth, but an incredible technological capability in and of itself, developed in the 1970s as a result of science and technology development put together, necessary to work very precisely, predictably, reliable, and achievement of mankind. As I said, to put up the space station. Here, this was the configuration of the space station on my first visit in May of 2000. These elements had been launched in 1998. As I said, in the lower left-hand part of the screen was the first module launched from Kazakhstan, built by the Russians. We actually contracted with the Russians to build it. It's called Zarya, which is Russian for dawn. So it was the dawn of this assembly. And then in the upper right part of the screen is a module called the Node module, or Unity is its name. It was launched on the Space Shuttle Discovery in the fall of '98, a couple of weeks after Zarya was launched. They rendezvoused with Zarya, grabbed Zarya with the robotic arm, mated the two together, and then released it. And that started the International Space Station. This is about 75 feet long, just to give you a little bit of scale. So the first time I went there was no crew on board. I remember it was 90 some degrees inside, and it stunk to high heaven because of some plastic materials that had been stored in there. It had been flying for about a year and a half or so. Again, before the first permanent crew. And then after that, later in the fall of 2000, we launched, actually in the summer, we launched another module from Kazakhstan, which provided life support systems. And then we launched from the US side on the space shuttle components that added these solar arrays in the upper part of the picture here that collected the sun's energy and charged batteries so that you could power everything. So now we had life support. We were able to maintain a healthy atmosphere. We had power supplies. So then the first expeditionary crew was launched on a Russian Soyuz in the November of 2000. And that crew was known as Expedition 1. And that started the permanent presence in orbit. We've had continuous human presence in space since then, since the fall of 1998. And a lot of people don't realize that. And I've had the privilege of being there 4 times over that time, and we continue. In fact, we just launched Soyuz last week from Kazakhstan that had 2 Russians and an American on board. We don't have time to talk about the current political environment, but I'll leave that for you for your homework to go do some reading on that. That even complicates it, as you might imagine, even more. We continued to build the International Space Station. It didn't look a whole lot different than this when I went back in 2006. And in 2000, starting in 2002, I got, as I like to say, banished to the Eastern Front. I was planning on flying a second space shuttle mission, but instead they needed me to go to Russia, and that started my time in Russia in 2002 or so, to prepare to eventually launch on a Russian Soyuz from Kazakhstan and spend 6 months on board the space station, which I did in 2006. At that time, it was after the accident where we lost the Columbia crew on entry. You might remember that. Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated on entry, and we lost the crew, grounded the space shuttle. It stopped our ability to continue the assembly of the space station. It largely compromised our ability to resupply the space station. So we went down from a crew of 3 to a crew of 2 so that we could reduce the supply requirements, because the only way we could supply the space station was through Russian assets. So when I went in 2006, it was as a crew of 2, my Russian crewmate and I, and we spent 6 months on board. Halfway through that stay, we started flying the space shuttle again. We had corrected the problem and resumed assembly of the space station. And we continued to build it. This was a phase I always thought was pretty ugly, a little asymmetric, but we're adding solar arrays to add power capability, adding modules to add the volume inside, and adding other capability eventually to get to the current configuration. Currently, we have a crew size of 7. If you follow the news, you know a couple years ago we started flying the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft, launching on a SpaceX rocket with seats of 4. So that provides a crew of 4, and the Russian Soyuz continues to supply a crew of 3. So we have 7 people on board. We just, as I said, exchanged the Soyuz crew last week. And within a couple of weeks, we should exchange the SpaceX crew. So we swap out part of the crew periodically, and everybody on average stays about 6 months, although we've had a couple of cases where they've stayed nearly a year. I went back a third time in 2009 in the fall and stayed to 2010 of the spring, so another 6-month flight. That was when we finished the assembly. And then most recently, I went back again for a third time, launching on a Russian Soyuz from Kazakhstan, stayed another 6 months when it's in full operational mode in 2016. When I got back in 2016, I realized very quickly that Anna Marie had had enough of that, and she wasn't going to let me go again. What we need to do is need to have another conference that gets her on the stage for Q&A as to how she endured all that. To this day, I recognize that I'll never comprehend what she went through. I knew what I went through, but I'll never comprehend fully what she went through. But I have great appreciation and love, of course, extended to her for the sacrifices that she made to support the calling that the Lord had given me in my vocation. Just some elements of the experience that usually I get questions about. What's the highlight of the experience? I have to say it's doing a spacewalk. I had the opportunity to do 5 of them. And a spacewalk is not a trivial ordeal. It's an all-day event. You're outside about 6.5 or 7 hours. It takes about 6 hours just to get in the suit and get it ready to go outside. You are a spacecraft in and of yourself. We call it a walk, but it's hand over hand crawling on the outside of this orbital outpost, this ultimate skydive is what I call it. You're in a pressure suit with 4.3 pounds per square inch of 100% oxygen. So you're working against the pressure of the suit the whole time. So when you come in, your hands and your forearms especially are just exhausted. Everything is choreographed very precisely. So it's a very focused endeavor. Every minute is it's choreographed. So you're using every minute that you're out there. You're running through a checklist that's highly choreographed, as I said, that's monitored by the Mission Control Center in Houston. So you're talking to them continually. But it's the highlight of the entire experience. It's the hardest thing physically and mentally we do, but lots of hard things in life become the highlights of life. And that's certainly true with doing spacewalks. Before they invented the term selfie, we were doing them. I'll just orient you here. I love this picture because of all the elements that are in it. Right, the black circle in the center is the objective lens of the camera, and the camera is wrapped in a thermal blanket. It's a white thermal blanket just to protect it from the extreme temperatures which are outside, which can vary in the sun from several hundred degrees above zero to in the shadows 150 or 170 degrees below zero. Just from either the sun's energy hitting different kinds of materials or the absence of the sun's energy and that material radiating all of the heat that is contained inside. So that's the reason for the thermal blanket. The reason that you see the shape of the view there is because it's a reflection of the helmet, the visor and the helmet. And we have a sun shield that is a gold-plated sun shield, and it's very reflective, like a mirror. So with that down, you point the camera at yourself, you get a great reflection from that convex helmet. And in this view, of course, you got a great view of the assembly of the orbital outpost we call the International Space Station, with the globe of the Earth behind it. And yes, as I said yesterday, the Earth is a globe. But great memories. Other aspects of the experience. Here's a picture of a rocket plume launching from Kazakhstan. This is either a Soyuz or a Progress supply ship. I forget which. But the space station is way out in front of it. We've already passed over the launch site, and then it launches, and it ascends into its orbit. And looking back, you can see the plume of the rocket here, illuminated by the sun's energy. And we've got this great picture. Of course, you can see the globe of the Earth with the clouds, weather systems. You see the atmosphere with the yellow arc. You see the star field in the background, and then you see the path of this rocket to get to orbit, to launched at a very precise time to eventually catch up and rendezvous and dock with the space station. Here's another fascinating view of a rocket launch. This one was just a few days ago, taken from the International Space Station when that Soyuz that I mentioned launched from Kazakhstan. They did a 2-hour rendezvous, so a very quick rendezvous. We used to take about 2 days to rendezvous and dock with the space station. Now we've shortened it down to about 2 hours. So when the rocket launched, the space station had just passed over the launch site. So the station was much closer ahead of the rocket on ascent. So, and then the crew used a telephoto lens to compress the plume of the rocket, and you get this kind of effect. And it's zigzagged because of the high winds that are up there, very high in the atmosphere, at the upper parts of the atmosphere. So this is showing that plume from the launch site on up into orbit. Another aspect, of course, is launch, and this is a Russian Soyuz, one of my launches. Here's another picture in daytime, and we have another short little video. Soyuz has been flying since 1967. much smaller than the space shuttle was, but it had a different mission. We carry a crew of 3 and a couple of 100 pounds of cargo. The space shuttle carried a crew of 7 and about 40,000 pounds of cargo, so a completely different mission. As I said, the Soyuz has been flying since 1967. They've done lots of upgrades over the decades, but it's still a very reliable workhorse, and it's really their only means to get crews, to get people to orbit. Now, and I'll just comment because I get a lot of questions on the media that over the years after the shuttle was retired about us being dependent upon the Russians and the Russians were really running us and that kind of thing. Complete false narrative. The Russians have actually been good partners, and the Soyuz rocket to deliver crews to the space station and return us safely to Earth has been a component of their contribution to the program right from the beginning. I marvel right now, even in the outworking of the providence of God, with the war going on, which is utter evil in all its manifestations beyond our comprehension, and but it's going on right now. But yet, by the kindness and the mercy of God, right or wrong, you may politically, we all wrestle with the question, but we're continuing to work out this program with great cooperation, kind of under the radar. And I still have a duty to coordinate our operations with all our international partners, to include Russia. So even that, I marvel at even today as we do that, and don't take it for granted. Another aspect of the whole experience, of course, is returning to Earth. As I said, the Columbia crew was lost on the return to Earth. It's very easy to imagine how risky it can be and how important it is for everything to work when you ride the rocket to orbit. It's equally important that everything work when you return, because all that energy that you expended on the rocket to get to the speed necessary to stay in orbit, you have to now get rid of that energy to safely get back on Earth. And you get rid of the energy through physics, by slowing down just a little bit. So now you're going to fall into the atmosphere. And as soon as you start hitting the atmosphere, the drag of the atmosphere, just like when you hold your hand out the window of a moving car and you feel the drag, we use drag to dissipate all that energy. However, you're going so fast, the friction is so high, the temperatures end up being about 3,000 degrees right outside plus. And as you enter the atmosphere, you first sense a faint glow, and then first on the sensor, you start saying, okay, we're 0.1 Gs, 0.2 Gs. We're starting to feel a little acceleration. And then it grows and grows and grows, both the acceleration as well as the glow outside. Pretty soon you're in a fireball, and you see all these flakes coming off through the windows in this fireball, and you realize that's the thermal protection system that's leading the way on the capsule, but it's eroding by design, but it's eroding over time. So the sparks that you see going by the window is the erosion of the thermal protection system. About that time, you're feeling 4 times the force of gravity. So if I weigh 200 pounds, you feel 800 pounds. And then it starts to dissipate. And then a few minutes later, a couple minutes later, the parachute opens. It takes about 25 seconds for the parachute opening sequence to fully deploy. It's the longest, believe me, 25 seconds of your life. Initially, you have a drogue chute come out, and it's very violent, and the capsule is spinning by design. The drogue chute comes out, so because of the spin and because it's attached off-center to the capsule, you're being thrown back and forth in your seat. And after about 15 seconds or so of that, there's a big explosion, and it's released, and now you're falling again. And then less than a second later, there's another explosion, and the main chute comes out. There's a huge opening shock, and then everything calms down. And then you're drifting down to the planet under the parachute, as you see in the picture here. And in all 3 of my cases, we had immediate contact with search and rescue airplane that was in the area, and they got a visual contact with us. So they talked us down. And then you get ready for the next major event, which is impact on the ground. Here you see just a couple of meters off the ground. You can see the capsule hanging below and the shadow of the capsule. So the shadow gives you an idea how far off the ground we are. And they, underneath the capsule, they have what they call soft landing thrusters, which are solid fuel rocket motors about this long and about that big around, 8 of them. And there's a sensor down there and then when it senses you're about this high off the ground, about 3 or 4 feet, it commands them to fire. So it's an explosive bang. It's like shotgun shells that size, 8 of them going off at one time. And it slows you down just a little bit more. They call them soft landing thrusters, but believe me, there's nothing soft about it. And this is what it looks like at the moment that they go off. It looks like the capsule's blowing up. And there's just a split second after that. And then the search and rescue forces, they've got not only an airplane, but multiple helicopters out there. And in all 3 of my cases, we landed right on target. And we had helicopters landing next to us within a minute of touchdown. You can see all the burning on the capsule there. That was from the entry through the atmosphere. But a system that's very reliable and quite an experience, as you might imagine. I want to read a quote. This is a quote. I spent a lot of time in Russia, obviously. I've accumulated about 6 years over there, 60 trips. Through the 2000s, most of my time over there, duration was about a month to 6 weeks at a time. And the commute was Moscow, Houston, train for 4 to 6 weeks, and then come back to Houston, continue to train another 4 to 6 weeks back to Moscow. So I spent a lot of time there. And the cosmonauts do the same thing. We're traveling together, especially as we get closer to a launch. We're training as a crew. I lived and worked in a place called Star City, or Zvozny Gorodok. It's the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center, named after Yuri Gagarin. Very historic place, closed city still to this day. So you have to have special access to get into it. But that's where we live and work. It's about an hour outside of Moscow, a little bit more by train. And there was a regional train, and on weekends I would go take the train into Moscow just to explore the city. And the train platform was called Tsiolkovsky Platform, named after Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. And here's a quote from Tsiolkovsky. He's considered one of the founding fathers of the Russian and later Soviet space exploration. He said, "From the rocket, we shall see the huge sphere of the planet Earth, like phases of the moon. We shall see how the sphere rotates and how within a few hours it shows all its sides successively. And we shall observe various points on the surface of the earth for several minutes and from different sides very closely. This picture is so majestic, attractive, and infinitely varied that I wish with all my soul that you and I could see it." He wrote that in 1911. A testimony to what I've been talking about in the provisioning of God's creation, his provisioning work, the work of his hands as a provider in his ordered and predictable creation. And we, bearing the image of God, and with all the components that include those that we talked about last night, having the ability and the desire and the drive to search it out, to subdue it, to have dominion over it. He was a theorist. He was a physicist. And he envisioned everything that I experienced in my career in the real world in 1911 because of the God-given ability and the laws of nature that had been discovered, the mathematical order of creation that had been discovered, not made, not invented by man, but discovered in order that God had placed in his creative work. Just in a profound illustration of that great truth. Science seeks what is true, and it rules out what is false. Sin is what tempts people and leads people to place science outside of a relationship with God. But science can only be understood inside a relationship with God. Job 28 is a fascinating chapter to me. And I want to, if you have a Bible, I would encourage you to open to Job 28. Job 28 affirms exactly what I've been talking about, that God in his creative work provisioned his creation uniquely with resources that are useful to us, and an ordering of those resources that is useful to us. And he gave us the ability to go find it, to search it out, to utilize it, to extract it, to develop it. Even the fact that we wonder, that we have a curiosity about things, that's step one, right? And then we go exploit that curiosity. Job 28 speaks exactly of that. In verse 1, surely there is a mine for silver and a place for gold that they refine. Iron is taken out of the earth, and copper is smelted from the ore. Man puts an end to darkness and searches out to the farthest limit the ore in gloom and deep darkness. Here we have a kind of a vision of a mining operation where mankind, again, contemplating these things, has the ability to, and even the thought to, hey, let's go explore deep under the earth and let's dig a hole. We call it a mine. And let's put people down there and search it out. And oh, by the way, anticipating that we're going to find something that's useful. Here we are in the oldest book of the Bible describing that. Verse 4, he, that is man, opens shafts in a valley away from where anyone lives. I mean, why would we even think about contemplating something that we might find far away and then deep underground? They are forgotten by travelers. They hang in the air far away from mankind. They swing to and fro. Again, we have this image of a deep mine shaft where men are lowered by a rope or something deep into the mine to get down to where they're excavating at the time. It's dark, but they've brought light. They've drilled a hole or made the hole, and now they've searched these things out. And they find the iron and the copper, the gold and the silver. Then verse 5 tells a different example, gives a different illustration of the provision in God's creation. As for the earth, out of it comes bread. But underneath it is turned up as by fire. They used fire to extract some of the minerals or to find some of the things they were searching for. Its stones are the place of sapphires, and it has dust of gold. That path no bird of prey knows, and the falcon's eyes has not seen it. The proud beast have not trodden it. The lion has not passed over it. Here we have the falcon that's known for its vision, right? It can see things. It sees its prey, and it does its dive. And this, I believe in the Hebrew, refers likely to a peregrine falcon, the fastest bird, I think, that we know of. In its dive for prey, but it can see things from way up. So it has vision beyond much of what we know. And the lion is king of the beasts, right? The lion has no enemies. It dominates its kingdom, if you will, its animal kingdom. But yet, the falcon and the lion have no sense at all about what's there before them. They utilize it. It's unique to mankind. Verse 9, man puts his hand to the flinty rock and overturns mountains by the roots. He cuts out channels in the rocks, and his eye sees every precious thing. We have the ability, again, to imagine what's in there and to go dig for it, to open it up, and to expose it. And then we take that on in science and we utilize it. We do experiments. We find, what can I do with this raw material? And, oh, I can do this with it. And what about this raw material? Oh, I can do this with it. And what if I combine them together? What if I do this or do that? Or what if I take this energy source and apply it to this raw material or this metal, uh, and we can make a battery? What if I take this energy that's all around us in the spectrum of energy, that light is only a small part of it, and I harness that and I use information and I put information on a radio wave, and it goes to a receiver which is made out of metal and other materials and whatnot, all put together by humankind. I always pull this out as a great illustration. Now we have the ability to access virtually any information you want. It might not be true, uh, but to access almost instantaneously from anywhere in the world, almost on any topic. And it's all right here in Job 28 with our God given ability and the provisioning of God's creation. What's the basic element of this? Silica. Yeah, that's why they call it Silicon Valley, which is sand. I mean, is that an amazing fact when we consider it? That's what Job 28 is talking about. But as a teaser for this afternoon, read let's see, verse 11, he dams up the stream so that they do not trickle. The thing that is hidden, he brings out the light. That's scientific progress. Verse 12, though, we'll use as a teaser for this afternoon. But where shall wisdom be found, and where is the place of understanding? Here we have something that the author of Job identifies as, although there's all this ability given to man, there's something that's out of our reach. It calls it here wisdom and understanding. We know it's there by virtue of asking the question, but it's unattainable. Even with all our abilities given by our Creator, we cannot get to it. We cannot access it. We cannot expose on our own light to it to illustrate it. That's the teaser for this afternoon, and hopefully that'll bring you back. All right.
Thank you so much, Jeff. You can sit there, and I'll sit over here while the guys are moving the pulpit out of the way so this half of the room can see. But I want to see if we got our guys set up for the microphones, and we can get some questions going here. All right, we got friendly-looking Nicholas and scary Steve over on the other side there. Don't be intimidated by Steve. He's a gentle soul, and he just wants to know what you're going to ask before you ask it. So thank you so much, Jeff. Fascinating presentation once again. And truly, we can see a gift of God in the, say like NASA. All science is a gift of God to show us the glory of God. And you've really made that clear. I have a question first. What kinds of, are there technologies that NASA has used that has come down to a consumer level? So you know what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Things have been spearheaded by exploration and discovery and technologies that get us up into space that have then trickled down into things that we may use.
I think there's lots of examples. I mean, there's an argument that can be made, and I think it's legitimate. I agree with it, that the race to the moon energized a lot of what we take for granted today in terms of technology. It energized public interest. It energized motivation for young people to go into school and major in different kinds of science, engineering, technology, mathematics. I mean, history shows that. The statistics show that. We've gone away from that quite a bit. That's why there's STEM programs now, because everybody recognizes there's a risk in the future if we don't have those kinds of skills in the population. It's actually a global race in some sense. That's why the issues with China are so critical for our national security. You can go. I always point people to the internet. Just go do a search for NASA spinoffs, and you'll find hundreds, perhaps thousands of ways that specific ways that the effort in the programs over the years have stimulated applications that we, as I said, largely take for granted on Earth. The space station, by the way, its primary purpose, I talked a little bit about the bigger part of the space station in terms of the overall strategy, this kind of the strategic vision. Uh, but it is an orbiting laboratory. I've done hundreds of experiments on the space station across the spectrum of different sciences, everything from life with plants and mice and hatching butterflies and growing plants, growing trees, and they have different objectives in the experiments, to material science, to science on study of humans. We're guinea pigs up there as well. As you said a couple days ago, lab rats. But we're doing experiments on ourselves all the time, trying to understand the impacts of the environment on the human body and then developing countermeasures for them. So it is a laboratory, lots of science going on all the time. My last flight, we did some DNA sequencing just to prove that we could do the capability. And of course, that'll lead into a lot of new research in biology. It's also a platform to develop technologies and technologies that will be required to go back for a more permanent presence to the moon, as well as eventually onto Mars, as I envision. We can develop lots of technology here on the ground, but until you get it in weightlessness and prove that it will work the way predicted, here developed with this gravity that we forget about sometimes and we take for granted. Gravity is a significant force and it impacts the way things work. So technology development is the other major objective of the space station. And then the third benefit of the space station is more abstract, and that is just the operation of putting it together, especially under an international partnership. All the technology integration that is necessary, and from 1998 to 2010, putting it together largely successfully with a few hiccups here and there that we had to work through, and then we're still flying it and still operating it. That's a huge achievement when you think about all of the components over all these years. And we're currently working with the partnership to continue flying it out to 2030.
Thank you so much for answering my question. And young people, just take note. Don't be afraid to do hard things. Hard things really pay off. Really pay off.
Yeah, hard things are important, and also when you fail on the path to trying to work toward those goals, don't give up.
Yeah, don't ever be afraid of failure.
Yeah,
that's right. Good, thank you. Start over here. Yes, sir.
First of all, I just wanted to say, thank you for coming out. It's a fantastic speech and a wonderful presentation you put together, and it's very well spoken and easy to understand, even for someone who doesn't have a great grasp of science. But my main question is, in a field that I at least assume the public sees as being so entangled with the conflict thesis, do you find many other believers in NASA, or is it mostly just people who are out there to prove that the universe came from nothing?
well, part of that, you could say, propaganda campaign is produces the public image that in the world of science and in the world of NASA or related endeavors, especially in the government agencies, it's devoid of believers, and it's in conflict with the Christian faith, and that's a lie as well. There are more believers than you might imagine among the astronaut corps, both currently and historically, and believers among the engineers and technicians and the managers within your organization as well. And that's also true with other areas of science. I have found the challenge is we don't get a voice, right? They're not going to make a big deal out of our perspective in the broader media unless they want to use us to actually attack us and use us as an example, to squelch the voice elsewhere. But no, they're believers everywhere. God has a remnant spread across everywhere.
Good question. Thank you. Yeah, Christy.
Hi. So my question is maybe a little bit similar to that, or kind of carrying on with that idea. As a believer, have you had any gospel opportunities with people that you've worked with, or people that you were in the space stations with for 6 months? I would imagine you have opportunity for great conversation with people. I was just curious if you had any gospel opportunities.
Yeah, there's been, as is true, I think, for all of us in life, whatever the circles of life that we are called into, we have those opportunities. I certainly have had those opportunities. They've been somewhat unique at times. Uh, Having the vantage point that we have to view the earth um, and see it in the context of even to consider, if you're not a believer, even to consider what's the cause of it all gives opportunity for some great discussions. Not with everybody, just like here on earth. Doors are open for us sometimes, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes people are open to those conversations, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're a little uncomfortable, but we work our way into it. Other times we never get an opportunity. And that's been my experience, not only in orbit, off the planet, as Anna Marie likes to say, but even in the training and the other processes here on the planet. I have found it's and your experience confirms this, I'm sure. When you get those opportunities, it's usually one-on-one because most folks they have the question, but they're embarrassed to enter into the conversation if there are other witnesses around that will hear them. So it's very hard to have those conversations with those folks that have maybe a spark of curiosity or are willing to have a conversation. But one-on-one, we need to be ready, right? As the scripture reminds us, we need to be ready. And those conversations have varied. Some people have been very receptive. Uh, some they weren't interested at all. In fact, they avoided it um, after the initial attempt, maybe. Uh, and you find different ways to avoid it. Remember, when we're on a crew in orbit, our lives literally depend upon each other. So there's a great emphasis in building a trust relationship and then maintaining that trust relationship. So you certainly don't want to be provocative up there. So it takes discernment and how you're going to do that. But when the Lord grants us opportunity, we need to be prepared to take it.
Can I follow up and just say, do you think that the way that you carried yourself as a believer, just the way that you endured the suffering or the trials or the tension, the pressure, I mean, maybe communicated
Uh,
that
thank
without
you.
speaking?
Thank you for that follow up because I meant to mention that. Um, yes, and that has been affirmed over and over and over again. Sometimes years after the moment, if you will, or the experience. It's a great reminder, and I like to tell young people when I'm speaking to either university or high school or children. We one with children, I'll remind them that your teachers, your parents, and others are investing themselves into you and grow to appreciate that, right? And extend your appreciation to that. But I also use it to point out that they are influencing children. We all influence people around us. And the vast majority of that influence we're not even aware of. And the influence is positive and negative. And I think most of us are well aware that our witness, our influence in terms of witness of our belief, our Christian faith, our witness to Christ is a powerful impact far beyond what we'll ever realize this side of eternity. Occasionally, in the kindness of the Lord, He gives us a little bit of feedback, right? Through circumstance where we have somebody come to us and say, you had a profound impact on me 5 years ago. And I just want you to know what the Lord did with that. And maybe they came to faith in that time frame. We have a huge impact, whether we know it or not, on the people around us. And we need to steward that properly because it can be positive or negative. Thank you.
And the character of the new nature shines through in how you
Absolutely.
deal with everything in life. Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. Steve, you got somebody over here?
What does the space station smell like?
You know,
Thank you for asking that question. What's your name?
Hudson.
Hudson. Thank you for asking that.
That's a great question. That's one of many right in that category. You just wonder what it feels like, what it smells like, as you said. Um, when I was toward the end of my 2010 flight, I was about to leave and I got that question and I said, well, it actually smells kind of like a sterile laboratory. You know, nothing strong about it, nothing unique about it, just a sterile laboratory. But I learned later it was an accommodation, and we can accommodate to our environment. Um, because then I was gone. I was back on the planet for 6 years and launched again in 2016. And smells are very familiar to us, right? When we go in and out of environments that have different smells, there can be a familiarity to smells. And that's true even when I climb into a Russian spacecraft. The materials they use are unique from, say, the Soy or the space shuttle. Um, the trainers in Russia have a unique smell just from the materials that they use. But when I launched on the Soyuz and a few hours later docked to the space station, we opened the hatches and I came in the space station. I thought, whoa, that's a familiar smell. And it's not good. It kind of,
What died in here? I left this place clean.
And I got with my crewmates, and we quickly had a meal together. And for me, it was like riding a bicycle. I'd been there already. I accumulated about a year in time and space, so I was back for my final flight. And and we were sitting there floating around the table, and I said, "So, what's this place smell like to you guys? Do you smell this?" And they were like, "No, it doesn't smell." So I knew right then that you accommodate to the smell. But then
we live in Greeley, Colorado.
Yeah, and I smelled your
We
environment.
understand.
We smelled it on the drive from Denver. Yeah.
They say it smells like money. I'm not convinced. Great question, Hudson. Thank you very
Thanks.
much. Xavier.
How do your contemporaries view you and your Christian worldview?
How do my contemporaries view? By the grace of God, I haven't suffered any, to my face anyway, criticism or ridicule or anything like that, any negative. I'm generally, I think, well respected by my contemporaries. Back to and it kind of combined with the previous question. We can be salt in the world, right? What does that mean? You think of salt as a preservative as a very simple illustration. We can, our influence can restrain sin. So I would say, large part my contemporaries, at least the feedback that I've gotten, and those that I've worked with, either close by or from a distance within view, respect is the first word that I would give. And to illustrate that, I remember having one crewmate in particular from another country that I worked with through the training process, and then we flew together. And he was largely very well behaved. He considered me kind of a father figure. It was his first flight. It was my third. I was a fair amount older than he was, and he demonstrated a high level of respect from me, even though our countries were former enemies. And that was my experience through the whole thing. We worked very well together. A couple of years later, he was assigned for his next flight, and he flew with different people. and one other American in particular. That American, uh, the reputation among fighter pilots and whatnot is to party hard and work hard, right, and fly to the edge and whatnot. That feeds on each other within a group. So, in large, I think it manifests the fear of man. If we have a weakness, if we consume alcohol, for example, but not in a responsible way, and I know there's some that would accept some consumption and some that would reject any consumption, and that's okay. That's not what I'm talking about. But let's say that we would consume some alcohol, but do it responsibly. That's different than being a weak brother or sister, where if we're caught into the environment where we have any kind of consumption, now we're led into the deeper pit of abuse of alcohol. That was my observation from a distance. That same person that stayed, I think, largely very well behaved, especially when I was around, that then went down into the worst consumption and patterns of behavior because had another American that would do the same thing. Um, so we have influence even in that way, even as salt. Even if somebody doesn't come to faith out of it, we are a restraint against the natural tendency of human nature to sin and to sin more. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. This might be a different question or maybe a follow-up, but um, you're in this day and age, a Christian worldview is completely anti-culture and what we believe in. Um, have you had discussions about that where um, they just, I don't know, they have
I,
different
it's
thoughts?
probably because I would think for a lot of people, I'm intimidating just by virtue of my job title. So I don't know this for a fact, but just observation and inference from um, observing people. I'm probably unique in that way. I'm kind of an enigma to some people. They can't reconcile my articulation of my faith with what I do. Um, and so maybe that's a dilemma among some people, but I haven't been engaged in terms of challenging my worldview. I've had some great intellectual discussions with a couple of non-believers who are scientists that don't get offended by the idea of faith or religion or Christianity or whatnot, but they're fascinated with my worldview, my explanation of God's unique creation and the provisioning of earth uniquely for our habitation. Some of the things I've touched on and what I'm going to go into more detail this afternoon. They're fascinated by it. I love those conversations, and but I've never been challenged. I've never had one of those rabid atheists or whatnot try to ridicule me or challenge me in that. Maybe the kindness of God.
Thank you.
Thanks, Xavier. Yes, Karen.
You have been working at this for so long, put in hard work, hard effort. The whole space program has been hundreds, thousands of people in Russia and in the United States putting in the hard time, the work, the effort. What is your thoughts on the future, especially with these super billionaires? I don't know if that's what you call them, thinking they can just pay to go up to space. Is that something that you're encouraging, or to me, I have a tendency to look at these people and just say, what are they thinking? They can make money, but there are people that have put decades of learning how to do this. And these people with, to me, more money than sense, think they can just fly into space. I mean, am I thinking incorrectly? And what is the future if that becomes a thing? I mean, I just don't know how to feel
It's
about
like
that.
space tourism, hotels
Yeah.
in space, and all that. Seems
Well, the
yeah,
Jetsons, but not really, sort of.
trying to bring the circus up and combine it with the science and up in
Sort of.
space. All right, Jeff.
Well, I've actually flown with two tourists.
Mhm.
We use the term spaceflight participant because the word tourist can be a little considered derogatory. Um, and I returned to Earth with one who had launched on the crew that was replacing my crewmate and I. And then later on another flight, I launched with one, and he stayed on board until the crew that we were replacing was returned to Earth about 8 days later. Both of those experiences were very positive. I was actually worried about the second one because it was Guy Laliberte, who was the founder of Cirque du Soleil, because and and
I
I
had no
thought,
idea.
yeah. And it turned out to be a wonderful experience with Guy. And back to the previous question, I pray that I was an influence on him
I
for the
bet
long
that'd be a
term.
great spacewalk, though, right? Cirque du Soleil out there. That brings an image to mind, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
All right, enough of me.
Well, we um, it was a good experience overall. I'll leave it at that. I did tell him a couple weeks into our training after we met, and he joined us the last couple of months leading up to launch. Their training is minimal, obviously, and I turned to him and I said, "Don't turn this thing into a circus." um, and he was very responsible, and it was a good experience. But so fast forward, now you're getting into the commercialization and the billionaires that are becoming well known through the media and whatnot. You know, everybody. I think you could you could analyze everybody differently, but everybody likes to leave a legacy in life. I think, or the idea of legacy. Our legacy, I hope that we aspire to be is faithfulness and obedience to the gospel in whatever the Lord calls us to in life. But others that don't have that, maybe are motivated by other legacies. So that there's that component. The policy of the government has long been to stimulate and to energize and to encourage commercialization of space. And those guys come to the table and they have some resources. Oh, but don't think they're just spending all their money for a joyride. They're entrepreneurial. They're developing a business. They're developing business cases, and even though it might look like joyride for millionaires and billionaires in the short term, they're building a business that's going to make money. They're not just throwing it all away. Um, SpaceX exists now and is going very successfully, largely because of contracts that he won with us and the Air Force for launch services. If you go back and look at the early days of aviation, the same kind of thing occurred. It's a different category. It doesn't necessarily equate, but it's at least a weak analogy. Uh, the government had the resources to do all the early research and development of new capability just to expand the performance of aviation. But eventually it seeded a path to commercialize it, assuming a business case. And now look at us. We're traveling commercially all over the country. Some of us seems like every week. And we do it routinely, and we do it comfortably, and businesses are making money. They're existing, not all, but so I don't know what the future holds, but it's got all those same components.
Great question, Karen. Thank you so much. Would you guys give him a hand as Josh comes up?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you again so much, Jeff. I have a question. What do you guys think is more soul crushing, for Justin Peters to sit in Kenneth Copeland's sermon, or for Jeff Williams to watch Armageddon? After hearing that, I bet it's pretty close. I have a few announcements for you guys as we get ready to head to lunch. On your conference guide, there's a map with a lot of lunch options, places, restaurants you can go to. But I'd like to encourage you all to. We have some food trucks, some local food trucks down here in this parking lot. We have a bunch of seating over here on the patio on the west side of the building. It was a great opportunity for you to stick around, to talk to people, to get to know more people. You can go save the map for dinner, maybe. Go out to some of those restaurants afterwards, and stick around here. And we really want to have a good testimony in our community. So please be kind to the food trucks and patient and nice to them. And if you're not going to be impatient, then yeah, maybe go to one of the restaurants close to Journey Christian Church and take your name tag off. But the rest of you stay here, be a part of that. The food trucks are called Seven Fish, so really good food truck, but not one you'd want on a space station, but but a really good food truck. There's another one called Gourmet Grub that I know a lot of you are familiar with, and then a taco truck called Tacos El Buque, which is which I'm being told they can only take cash right now. So if you want tacos, make friends with someone who has cash, and maybe trade a book or something. Keychain. You can pull the keychain card now if you've got one of those. The bookstore will be open for the duration of the lunch break, so maybe you can. So we're going to break until 2, so you've got plenty of time to eat. So some of you can go bookstore, some of you can go down and get food, and then swap and just go back and forth between the whole lunch break. But another reminder, 12:45 back in the coffee shop area. We're going to have Jeff's going to be back there doing book signing. So you can start lining up in there at 12:45 if you've bought. He's going to sign his book, by the way. Don't just bring any book. Buy that book, bring it in there. And as you return from lunch, we have gifts for everyone, every adult who registered for the conference. Our good friends at Grace to You, who have always been so generous to us. Every time we do a conference, they're giving 2 books to every adult who registered for the conference from both sides of our science and the circus thing. So for some of the stuff that Justin's been talking about, the John MacArthur's book, Charismatic Chaos, which is just a foundational, extremely important book that really expands on a lot of the issues, a lot of the problems that Justin's been pointing out. You're going to want this book, and then if you use your name badge, you have $10 off in the bookstore. I don't know if you just make sure you all knew that. And then if that topic interests you, use that to buy the book Strange Fire if you don't have that. Another very important, groundbreaking book that you need for that. Well, the other book you'll be getting is John MacArthur's book, The Battle for the Beginning, which Jeff recommended to a bunch of us yesterday. It builds out of that Christian worldview that Jeff has said, you have this worldview and then you do science out of it, and there is no conflict, but you see no conflict between science and the Bible at all. So make sure that you grab those. You can do them. There'll be a table, I think, over here as you're coming back. Just go over there. They're going to do something to your card to indicate that you've taken it. But that'll be back there for the rest of the day as you're coming back from lunch. All right. And there's one set for every adult who's registered. All right. With that, we're going to break. Let me pray for us as we head into lunch. Father, we are indeed so thankful for everything that we have been able to see and experience today. That we're so thankful for what we've learned from these wonderful men of God that you've provided here, and we're looking forward to an afternoon of more of that. We pray now as we go out into lunch that it would just be a wonderful time of Christian fellowship, new relationships can be started between between fellow believers during this time. Lord, if there's anyone in here who does not know you, who is maybe hearing some of this stuff and it's difficult for them, Lord, we pray that they would be connected with a Christian who's here that can help answer questions, to walk them through that wonderful, beautiful gospel message that Justin Peters shared earlier. Thank you so much for food. Thank you for your provision for that. Thank you for the kindness of these people, these food trucks who have come here today. We ask all of these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. You are dismissed.